Hello, friends. Welcome to this webinar, Yes, Gawd, How Faith Shapes LGBTQ Identity and Politics. I'm Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, the host of tonight's program. LGBTQ RAN is a unique venture dedicated to preserving the history of LGBTQ religious movements around the world. LGBTQ RAN is a digital enterprise. We are not a physical repository that stores papers. We advise and support leaders and groups in their efforts to preserve their records in appropriate archives. Furthermore, we collect and provide a treasure trove of historical information on our website about LGBTQ plus persons and groups from a wide array of religious expressions around the world. And finally, we encourage research and scholarship in queer religious history. Tonight, LGBTQ RAN board member Jim Miltulski will interview Royal G. Cravens about his newly published book, Yes, Gawd, How Faith Shapes LGBT Identity and Politics in the United States. In this work, Craven explores how faith impacts the politics of LGBT people, detailing how the queer community creates, defines, and experiences spirituality and spiritual affirmation, as well as the consequences this has to their identity, socialization, and political development. In order to demonstrate the mobilizing power of faith for LGBT people, Cravens explains how factors such as coming out, race, and LGBT-affirming churches influence political attitudes and behavior, and how the development of LGBT political religious activism provides opportunities for LGBT people to organize politically. Our presenters, the Reverend Dr. Jim Miltulski, is a pastor, activist, community organizer, and fundraiser. He has pastored churches in the United Church of Christ and the Metropolitan Community Churches. Jim has served as the denominational director of development and clergy vocations for MCC, and taught courses at Pacific School of Religion and United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. He is currently the pastor of the Congregational Church of Belmont in California. Royal G. Cravens, PhD, is a senior research analyst at the Southern Poverty Law Center. He is a previous recipient of the Bailey and Cynthia Weber Awards from the American Political Science Association, and has held fellowships with the Social Science Research Council and Public Religion Research Institute. For those of you watching this webinar, we welcome your comments or questions in the chat box or the Q&A functions. The presenters will respond to those during the Q&A time toward the end of tonight's program. If you would like to offer personal greetings or comments to the presenters, stay after the webinar has concluded and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. Please direct any technical concerns to Riot Mueller, who is the tech manager for this program. Now, I am pleased to welcome Jim Miltulski and R.G. Cravens to open their conversation with us.
Thanks, Mark, for a great introduction and setup for our discussion about Yes, Gawd, How Faith Shapes LGBT Identity and Politics in the United States. I'm so glad to be here with the author, R.G. Cravens. And though he's a distinguished scholar, I do want to say I did ask permission to just call him R.G. So, but his educational bona fides are impressive. R.G., it's so good to see you.
It's good to see you, Jim, and thank you for agreeing to host me, and to the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network for agreeing to host this webinar. I'm so excited to be here and talk with you all this evening.
Well, you know, I thought we would just launch right in. First of all, I don't think there could be a more timely time for your scholarship to be released, because LGBT identity and religion are both prominent features of what's happening in our national discourse. And I did want to ask you about the book the title itself, because this is a thing that many of my friends have asked me about. They say, what's with the yes, God, Gawd? And of course, I looked it up. I know what it means, but I'm asking you, how did you land on this title?
Well, there's a lot of different reasons, I think, but for those in the know, the title "Yes, God," it's an enthusiastic affirmation, right? It's a way to express support, to express all the vibrancy that I think is, and in a way, right, because of the lineage from the Black queer community, a way to express the diversity inherent in LGBTQ identity and in LGBTQ religious identity. And so, along with that idea of expressing that enthusiastic support, I thought because the book was largely about the role and impact of affirming faith traditions, that it was a fitting title.
Well, the subtitle, How Faith Shapes LGBT Identity and Politics in the United States, you could add another one to it, which is RG uses data to challenge the binaries. And you really do challenge a lot of different kinds of binary thinking in this. And of course, I'm using the word intentionally, but that there's a separation between LGBT and religion. That there's a separation between religion and politics, that there's a separation between secular and being pro-LGBT, that you could have an identity that is pro-LGBT because of religion uh, or a position. Uh, all those kinds of binary ways of thinking that have been characteristic of scholarship in the past. You take it on and you back it up.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's a good point to start out with here, Jim, for one of the reasons I think that was so important to write the book and to do the research. Um, Faith is a major component of the LGBTQ experience. And that is something that unfortunately, I think social science researchers have ignored for a long time. Scholars of religion tend to ignore for a long time. I've had some conversations with folks, you included, about the sort of limited availability of data on the subject. So we don't have a lot of data in general about the religious demographics of LGBTQ people. And that's partly too because of the assumption that a lot of scholars have used to inform their work, which says, you can't be LGBTQ and religious. That's an assumption, and it's also a political construction, right? It's a way to divide, to sort of set LGBTQ people aside and say, no, that this realm is not for you. You're not welcome here. And it's used to politically divide. And I think it's important to say that social science research doesn't support the assumption, first off, right? I go to great pains, I think, in the beginning of the book to kind of lay that out, to not just use the data that I've collected, but sources of survey research from multiple examples of the congressional, what's called the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, and the Social Justice Research Study, and the General Social Survey, right? All of these different places to sort of show at the outset that faith is a major part of LGBTQ experiences, and that most LGBTQ people would identify with some faith tradition. Now, we can talk about the finer points, right, of what that means and how important faith is, and participation and practice and those kinds of things. But at the basic level, most LGBTQ people would identify with a faith tradition of some kind.
Well, and I think that you have a punchy introduction. The very first paragraph, you're challenging, in a sense, what we think of as LGBT, particularly, well, I'll just read it. Dominant, being stereotypical representations of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people in society operate on what I've referred to as the will and grace paradigm. By that, I mean LGBT identity has generally been constructed in popular culture and to a greater extent in the scientific literature as predominantly gay or lesbian, cisgender, white, middle or upper class, and metropolitan. While Will and Grace was groundbreaking, the program featured two gay lead characters It was one of the first network television programs to air a kiss between two men, depicted LGBT people and families in sympathetic circumstances, and led then Vice President Joseph Biden to declare the show did more to educate the American public than almost anybody's ever done so far. You know, that's a broad and brilliant statement, I think, and you indicate right from the very start that in the data that you're going to be collecting, you pay attention to the nuances of race, of gender, of class, and rather than falling prey to the same kind of broad swath depiction of even what LGBT identity is, this material will be challenging, I think, even to a gay audience.
Well, I hope so, and I appreciate the attention page there to that introduction. I think you're right. It's really important, and it's very important for me to say those things as well. To look at the LGBTQ community, and to unpack right those intersections of identity, and to certainly recognize all of the things that you said that we have been that we have been given depictions, right? Increasingly, sympathetic depictions of LGBTQ people. We're seeing representation, right, increase, and these are all good things. And we need to be cognizant of the fact that those representations are in many ways missing, right? Those nuances and those intersectional ways of being, right? That make up, again, that diversity that's just inherent to the LGBTQ community, and we can't ignore that. We shouldn't ignore that. And you know, we know that. So as a political scientist, right, looking at the literature, we know that interest groups, for example, advocacy organizations that do political work, when they're dominated by folks who are sort of the prototypical members of the category, right? Like that will and grace paradigm, when that exists in political spaces, we know that it skews the political outcomes of a group, or I guess I should say the political priorities of a group, right? The priorities look different because folks aren't equally represented in the decision-making processes. And so it's really important, I think, to focus in on these intersections. And the one, you know, that was really important for me for this work, and you know, comes from experience in the subject, right, is the intersection of religious identity, right, and unpacking that unfortunate but definitely dominant political construction of LGBTQ people as, you know, unreligious, which is just false.
Yeah, I mean, you make that point. People are religious, and LGBT people are religious, and you also distinguish, I think, in a chronological way. Let's pick the 2000 as a turning point. I mean, there's more than one, but the kinds of evolution of what's been happening with LGBT issues in religion was different, and now we're in yet a new era. And so you reference and appreciate the LGBT independent, self-determined churches like MCC and Unity Temple. I loved what you said about MCC. I'm an MCC minister, and I pastored MCC churches for a long time before I started pastoring in the UCC. But some religious LGBT people, especially those who are learning to reconcile their LGBT and religious identities, find LGBT-led congregations helpful in alleviating psychological stress or conflict instigated by internalized homophobia. Indeed, some newly out LGBT people may join an LGBT-led denomination or congregation, but once identity integration has been sufficiently mitigated, they move on. And that was kind of a relief to read as one who's loved and given my life really to MCC, but also painful and but accurate. I've seen it. It's true. The needs of the current and maybe just prior generation are different from those of us who came out in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I mean, do you want to comment about that?
Yeah, well, you know, I think that's a big part of, especially the first part of the text, right, is understanding the coming out process, and how religion and coming out are big, impactful factors that are really deeply intertwined in the lives of a lot of LGBTQ people. And part of that, I think what the one of the big sort of takeaways is that having received positive messages, sort of what I call positive socialization in the book, right? But having received positive messages about LGBTQ identity from religious leaders in the past isn't actually an important predictor of future religious activity, of future religious behavior, of actually changing your faith tradition after coming out. So if you're, affirmed by a faith tradition before coming out, you're less likely, at least in the sample that I surveyed. It's helpful to preserving, I guess you could call it the continuity of faith identity over time, right? By having that affirmation early. So it's something too that I've seen. We have seen, right, in trends in other areas of social scientific research where we know the importance of affirmation for LGBTQ young people early on. That makes a huge difference, right, in later health outcomes, and it's kind of similar here to how faith can be a very important guiding factor. And obviously on the other side of that, then if you are raised in a tradition or in a time, right, when faith is used as that weapon, that cudgel to sort of harm the development of LGBTQ identity, then you see that in the data it's borne out that conflict, what I've called psychic conflict between your LGBTQ identity and your religious identity, is increased. And that has implications too, right, for how you deal with faith later on down the line, but how you look at politics, and it really shapes your identity. So, absolutely, right. I think religion and faith and coming out, right, are deeply intertwined. Yeah, that we see. I know I've mentioned this before, but I wish we had even more data of this over time phenomenon, so we can see, because coming out is a process. It's not always complete, right? It doesn't always just turn on and off, sort of like a switch. And so it would be really beneficial to be able to study this even further over time to really unpack. But I think this book, I think, gives a good indicator of those trends. And yeah, I'm really interested in I guess I could go on about some of the other details that are coming out, but I'll stop there and maybe we can allow time for questions about it if it comes up later.
I do want to appreciate also, again, I mentioned this earlier, but I think it really comes through in the research that you encourage the reader to pay attention to all the aspects of identity, particularly as it relates to LGBT identity. And this was another one of your zinger sentences, and they're all the way through, and they're so important to interrupt how we think, how I think, certainly. For LGBT people of color, however, being LGBT might not be a big deal in an LGBT-led congregations, but being a person of color often can be in these predominantly white spaces. So from the very beginning, the arc of your research requires that we pay rigorous attention to dynamics of race and class and gender.
Oh, absolutely. The LGBTQ people of color, especially Black LGBTQ people, are the most religious subgroup in the data set, right, of respondents that I surveyed. Black LGBTQ people are also the least likely to change their religious affiliation after coming out in this data set, which I think is important to say. They're also, importantly, more likely than any subgroup to say they have changed their social behavior because they're made to feel uncomfortable in LGBTQ spaces due to religion. And I think that's important to say because LGBTQ people of color in the data set that from this book are feeling alienated, right? So we can say that LGBTQ people of color are feeling alienated in LGBTQ spaces, and I think we have to recognize that. We have to for a lot of different reasons. It has implications for both religious communities and secular political communities. I mentioned earlier the sort of political dynamics of what happens when we don't have representation, when we overlook intersections, we have movement priorities that run askew. And the same thing happens in faith communities who have struggled with racial inclusivity and need to do better. And secular activism has struggled, LGBTQ secular activism has struggled with religious inclusion and also with racial inclusion. And those institutions need to do better. And so it's very important to focus in on the lived experiences, the lived religious experiences of LGBTQ people of color. And I do, I hope to built on some great scholarly work that already exists on the subject, and just adding to that was a really important part of this book for me too.
Well, one of the binaries that you identify, if you will, is the binary existence of LGBT politics and its ambivalence around acknowledging the role that of religious identity. And it's simply true. And as a person who's been working in this movement for multiple generations now, it has often been hard to straddle both realities, even in an LGBT religious organization. The political people are hesitant to take it seriously, to acknowledge it. And it reminded me of even during AIDS, how public health people were also a little phobic about religious identity and gay religious identity, even though this disease required them to pay attention to this.
Yeah, I think this is another important part of this for me too. I'm not saying in the book that the LGBTQ movement has to convert, non-believers. But the LGBTQ movement, political movement, ignores religious diversity among its constituents really at its peril. Because we've already said faith is a major part of the experiences of LGBTQ people, and as long as it's ignored by the LGBTQ movement, the religious right is going to run the show in terms of building a political narrative that says you can't be both LGBTQ and religious, and that's deleterious for a lot of reasons, but most importantly, that sort of prejudiced belief of reality is used all the time to justify laws that erode LGBTQ civil rights. And if we allow that perspective to go uncontested, that you can't be LGBTQ and religious, then the opponents of equality will continue to use faith, I think, as a justification for limiting LGBTQ rights. And I'm not trying to wade into the sort of philosophical disputes, but I am making an argument, and I think it's now supported by a lot of studies, that faith is this major component, right, of LGBTQ identity, but ignoring it cedes ground to the opponents of LGBTQ equality politically, right, and it perpetuates marginalization even within LGBTQ-led spaces.
And that ignoring that as a factor has also made political organizing difficult in a variety of ways. I can't help but think also, just today, the Southern Baptist Convention is meeting, and they passed an anti-in vitro fertilization stance in a denomination that in 1980 was pro-choice and certainly not against contraception. How does that happen, except that the same political figures who were religious, like Jerry Falwell, et cetera, have been successful in commanding the discourse and the direction. And so those of us who are involved either in LGBT politics or LGBT religion have to be literate about what how that took place and how it's affecting us.
Absolutely. And I think there's some examples of this. Absolutely, there's plenty of examples in the text, but I was going to say an example of one of the chapter titles where to talk a little bit about the data in the book. What I did was certainly use survey data that I collected primarily myself, and I also then supplemented that with another survey that was more long form, that allowed longer responses. So most of the graphics, if you look in the book, right, there's several charts and graphs and things, and that's built on this representative sample of LGBTQ people in the United States. But there's also an underlying what you can call qualitative analysis of responses that came from a second survey that I did. And one of the chapter titles is actually "My Politics Are My Religious Beliefs." And that was from one of the surveying respondents, one of their long form answers whenever I was asking, how do you view religion and politics and LGBTQ identity? How are these things related to you? And I thought that was just a really profound statement, right? We know that religion, that the institutions of religion, that faith, that these things impact politics, and they shape the way we understand the world. And so I just thought that was really a profound way of putting it, right? Is that as that one respondent said in particular, my politics are my religious beliefs. And that's true of LGBTQ people in a lot of cases.
So do you think that the more effectively a person integrates their LGBT identity, does this also really make them more effective change agents, and really more likely to engage the political process in I don't want to say in a progressive way, but
well, I think that's interesting, right? Because that's part of what I unpack, I think, in the book. Surely is the way that faith influences political participation, right? So the way that LGBTQ people engage in politics, the different mechanisms and pathways to participation, and then also the attitudes of LGBTQ people. So I do explore both of those things. And one of the important things is that the data consistently show that participation in a faith community it's a predictor of political engagement. That LGBTQ people who participate in a faith tradition are also more likely to be politically active. And I think that speaks a lot, right, about the mobilizing potential of LGBTQ faith communities. I think that that's something that we really should consider, is the role that could be played there. Part of that is because the way that I sort of break it down in the book is try to explain that opportunities are presented for learning about social organizing, right, in your faith tradition. So as you participate in religious communities more, you're exposed more to opportunities to lead events, right, or to organize gatherings, or to in different ways take part in behaviors that are just as necessary for secular political activity. And that's important, right? And as the number of LGBTQ affirming congregations have expanded, as more congregations have welcomed LGBTQ membership and expanded opportunities for participation, then it makes sense, right? That as those opportunities increase, that there are increasing opportunities for LGBTQ people to then translate that into political activity. So to be more politically active. But importantly, and I guess we can get into this a little later too, but that participation in an affirming religious congregation doesn't automatically translate into progressive ideology, right, or progressive attitudes. And so there's some other things that have to happen there. But it's pretty consistent that participating in a faith community does increase political activity, political behavior.
Right. Let's talk about your research for a moment, or not for a moment, for as much as you want, because the book itself does contain a lot of the data, sometimes summarized, and certainly well footnoted. It's more of an academic book than a popular book, but you certainly can read it without having an academic background. And additionally, you've provided links to more in-depth presentations of your data. And I guess I wanted to ask you, because I think there's some really new and groundbreaking things that isn't replicated other places here.
Yeah.
Was it difficult for you to sell, if you will, or to make a case for, probably a better way to say it, doing this research itself in the institutions that you were working in?
That's a good question. And it was, I guess I can say pretty frankly that it was, and it can be there. Aversion to especially funding LGBTQ centered research is a real thing in the social sciences. We've had a lack of funding, to say the least, for research to better understand intersectional identities in marginalized communities. It's underfunded. And so that's some place where I think institutionally speaking, research institutions could do better to do those sorts of things. But also, you have to combat the assumptions, right, that we mentioned earlier. Part of that is, the homophobia and transphobia that are inherent to a lot of the academic institutions. So, there's lots of research out there. I actually point to some of it in the text too, that in social science disciplines, in political science, there's room for improvement for recognizing the contributions of LGBTQ scholars, but also the contributions of understanding marginalized identities to how politics works, generally speaking, right? People like to think that you can just, oh, well, you study LGBT politics and that's good to understand LGBT people. But what most people don't understand is that when you study marginalized communities, you learn how the process of politics and democracy really work, right? Because you're shedding light on how decision making is made and who is excluded and who is included, and how the process, we think theoretically democracy should work this way, but how is it actually playing out? And you only get that perspective, when you study and when you can center the experiences of marginalized communities. And that's just not a dominant way of thinking when it comes to funding research and when it comes to prioritizing things for academic institutions.
It could appear to people who are reluctant to see social change that the research at all is advocacy per se. And
absolutely.
It's not. You're really telling a story that needs to be told to understand, in this case, democracy.
Exactly.
Complex society.
And two, it's sometimes it's the closeness, right, to a subject. It's the understanding that you get from having experienced some of these things yourself that leads you to ask the right questions, right? That leads you to get to the information that's really important to help understand what's going on. It's the proximity that you have to the subject, right? It's not an indicator of bias. It's giving you insight that you wouldn't otherwise have. And that's true of the study of religion and the study of LGBTQ politics. You don't have to be religious to study religion. You don't have to be LGBTQ to study LGBTQ politics. I'm not saying that, but certainly the proximity to those structures and institutions and processes and experiences, they do inform, how you the questions you ask and the methods that you use to answer them.
So, I mean, certainly your research is highly rigorous and I think impartial, but does the fact that you grew up in a religious environment, is that an asset that you bring to this?
I would say so, just like all of the scholars of religion really who laid the groundwork, the foundations for things like the sociology, the sociological study of religion. A lot of the early sociologists were in fact either pastors or children of pastors, or children, of religious leaders, not just pastors. And it was again that proximity that helped them see the importance, right, of what they were experiencing, the impact that it had on the development of their community and the development of politics in their community. So it is that proximity. Absolutely, I think I'm definitely privileged to grow up in a community that gave me a rich amount of experience to draw from. I mentioned this in the book. I actually graduated from an Episcopal university, but I was raised in a Pentecostal denomination in the rural South, and each of those things in their own ways have sort of, again, shaped the research questions that I've asked, and they really did help to inform my understanding of LGBTQ identity and help me ask questions. I've told this story several times in different places, but I often do reflect on how this book came about was because I did a lot of political organizing, things like voter registration drives, but also working for Pride, Pride organizing, LGBTQ equality work in rural Southern communities. And it was just having questions at spaces like, an LGBTQ club, for example, right, over a voter registration table, talking about the impact of faith, in those spaces and understanding the diversity of lived experiences, that got me to ask, well, how important is the kind of organizing work that I'm doing? And then, to ask the questions about the diversity of experiences that I was actually seeing, doing the sort of political mobilization work, and absolutely those were big parts what brought this book to fruition. So I think it was beneficial.
You obviously put a lot of work into preparing the research tools, the instruments, but did you learn anything surprising, or what surprised you most about when you actually got the results that perhaps you hadn't anticipated or hadn't seen?
Oh, I think that's a good question. You know, I kind of expected, so I by means of segueing maybe into another part of the findings. I think a lot of us and the folks who study right these institutions like how faith impacts religion or faith impacts politics and attitudes. I think I expected there to be a very similar relationship, like that affirming LGBTQ faith would increase political activism, but it would also be associated with liberal political attitudes. That was a hypothesis that I had, right, going into this. And interestingly, after I was looking through the data, it took me a little bit of time to kind of figure out what I was seeing and what the processes that were working actually were, how they were working and what they were telling me. And so the effects of participation in LGBTQ affirming faith traditions, that has a different kind of, maybe a more subtle or nuanced effect than the direct effect you see on participation when you're talking about attitudes. So participating in an LGBTQ affirming congregation, it doesn't automatically, I think I said this before, make you a political liberal or a Democrat. Some, Jim, working may know this better than others, right? Dealing with folks in religious spaces, and in fact, religiosity, like attending services and the importance of religion alone, is typically associated with political conservatism, even among the LGBTQ people that I surveyed. And so, what I thought was really fascinating is that LGBTQ people who participate in affirming spaces are cultivating different ideas about their own identities with relation to their spirituality. And so that's different than LGBTQ people who are religious but aren't in affirming spaces. So LGBTQ people in affirming spaces are more likely to believe that being LGBTQ is not a sin, believe that God accepts LGBTQ people, right? And that LGBTQ identity is innate. And those are the things that are associated with more liberal political views than actually the participation, right? Just attending a congregation itself. So it's like this indirect relationship that affects political attitudes. And I know that's maybe a little in the weeds for the audience, and I apologize. but that was sort of the most interesting thing for me, is that I expected this very direct result, but it wasn't that at all, right? It was a much more subtle, indirect way of learning about who you are and developing a sense of identity and developing a sense of knowledge about faith and a deepness, right, of knowledge about it that really that really influences attitudes. So that to me was probably the most interesting thing.
Can you give one example of the data and how it applies to one of these insights?
Yeah, sure. So, I think the survey questions here that I'm talking about include, I measure things like your attitudes towards government service. So whether or not you think, the government should provide social services. I measured attitudes towards equal protection for LGBTQ people, right? So whether or not, and I think one of the more interesting things is the use of public facilities for trans people, right? So trans civil rights were measured here, abortion rights and gun control and immigration. And in all of those cases, there were two things I think that stand out. One is that folks who believe things like being LGBTQ is not a sin hold more liberal political attitudes on all of those things. The other thing I think that is interesting was that the biggest predictor of conservative attitudes is about the authority you place in your religious tradition. So the authority that you believe your tradition has over defining LGBTQ identity was a big predictor of conservatism. The more you thought that a single faith tradition has that ability to define what it is to be LGBTQ, the more conservative your attitudes tended to be.
You correlate people's perception of themselves and their self-acceptance with how susceptible they are to religious authority figures. So a lot of gay people or queer people continue to participate in the Southern Baptists, in the Mormons, in the Roman Catholics. Do they participate more critically or?
You know, I think that's a good question. I actually asked this as part of studying what coming out means, you know, in this context, and why some LGBTQ folks would change their faith tradition after coming out, and others might not. And I mentioned earlier, you know, positive social messages early on. So getting messages about, you know, positive notions of LGBTQ identity from faith leaders early on was one reason why folks wouldn't change. But interestingly, what I found was that coming out later is a person is less likely to change their faith tradition after coming out if they come out later in life. If they have conflict with their LGBTQ identity and faith, you know, and religious identity, they're actually more likely to change. And then the chances of changing your faith, changing your religious identity after coming out also decreases if you are the sort of older you are. So I tried to unpack this a little bit and better understand why some people might stay, right, in an unaffirming, or what we might call an unaffirming tradition. And there could be lots of reasons. I've got some, you know, I mentioned just some of the demographic ones there that seem to be indicators of it. But I think for me, what it gets back to largely is relationships, to be honest. It's socialization. It's the connectedness that you feel to a community. And in some cases, the connections that you feel are outweighed by or outweigh, I guess I should say, the sort of liberation that you get or feel after you come out. And so we need to recognize that, right? And I think it's very important to say this too, that LGBTQ people exist in those traditions, right? You're saying there are LGBTQ Latter-day Saints, there are LGBTQ Roman Catholics, there are, right, places where we would traditionally or often think of, right, where it's just incompatible, again, to be LGBTQ, but LGBTQ people are there and they're existing, and a lot of times they're working to carve out places of acceptance, right, and to work on reforming theology and doing these things. So the other part of that is that, you know, there are some demographic factors, but a lot of times folks, LGBTQ folks especially, are willing to stay in these places because they see the ability to change and affect change, and they've been successful, right, in the past. And they're still working in those places. And so that's empowering, I think, in a lot of ways to think of, right? Like you're in a space where, you know, it may seem hostile even, but LGBTQ people are there and they're thriving and they're working towards equality. And that's really important.
I've got one more question, and then we're going to have to stop. And this has flown by, but as you've conducted your research, and this is from Mary Biggs, and more generally, as you continue to be active in your religious life, have you experienced disturbing, negative, or hostile reactions? Have you responded? How have you absorbed this into your work and your life, or has this never troubled you?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, I think that how do I say, have I experienced, you know, hostility reactions, not necessarily associated with this work, thankfully, but, you know, yes, I think having experienced homophobia, you know, having sort of been victimized in those ways, that certainly, again, kind of got me thinking about the ways that the things in our lives help us to deal, right, with what we experience. And so faith is certainly a way that a lot of LGBTQ people help build resiliency. It's a connection to the community that they often trust and that they feel, you know, is safe. And so it helps folks to deal with those you know, situations that are when they're directly targeted or when they're victimized. I think for me, it's important to sort of not so much focus on myself, but to say that my current work has largely dealt with the attacks to our civil institutions that LGBTQ people are experiencing. So LGBTQ affirming congregations in this country are under attack. I think it's pretty safe to say that they're experiencing hostility from a political movement that is not interested in pluralism, right? That is willing to perpetuate that notion that you can't be LGBTQ and religious, and they don't like the diversity, right? That's inherent in understanding faith that way, and that's detrimental to our civil. To those civil institutions. It's also detrimental to our democracy, and so I do worry, right, about that aspect of it, where there is an effort to erode pluralism, and that's a place where the LGBTQ faith community, but also interfaith communities, right, and allied communities have a responsibility to stand up and say that these places are under attack, but we will not stand for those kinds of erosions. And so I think there's also a message of empowerment there, right? It's that we know now, the research tells us, LGBTQ religious folks can make a difference and are politically active and are doing this work, right? And now we need allies to step in and do that work with us too. And it is possible to change those people.
I thoroughly agree. This is a very empowering book, and I hope that you will continue to work in these ways. I want to commend that you've changed your context a little bit and working now with the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I urge people who are watching this to Google RG and Southern Poverty Law Center, look for the Captain's study, and see the ways that you're laying the groundwork for further intersectional, liberation-oriented data. You've been fantastic, RG, and I really appreciate that you've given this time to us.
Thanks, Jim. It has really meant the world to me. You just don't know, all the audience don't know how excited I am to be able to talk with Jim. Thank you all so much, and thank you, Jim, for taking the time.
You bet. I think Mark's going to take over from now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jim and RG, for this provocative, informative discussion. And thanks to all of you who listened, offered comments and questions. Within a few days, you will all receive an email with a link to the recording of tonight's program that you can share with friends and colleagues. And if you were intrigued enough by this discussion to want to get a copy of the book, Temple University Press offers you a discount when you're ordering the book from their website. So if you order the book, RG's book, from the Temple University Press website, use the discount code T20P. That's T as in Tom, 20, and P as in Paul. Use that when you order the book and you'll get a discount. And if you're interested in more opportunities to explore the history of queer religious movements, check out the LGBTQ-REN website, and particularly our events page, which includes program announcements of future online programs, as well as recordings of past presentations. Our next program on Wednesday afternoon, July 24th, will be quite different and fascinating. LGBTQN archivist Doris Malcolmus will give you an inside look behind the scenes of the archives. She will take you on a virtual tour of the Trotter Collection in LGBT Studies in Minnesota, as well as the main library of the Wisconsin Historical Society. You can sign up now to join this Zoom webinar again on July 24th. In closing, I remind you that LGBTQ-RAN is the first and foremost source of information on LGBTQ plus religious history. We are a very small operation that is funded through the generosity of friends like you. So if you would like to see more programs like this one, and if you share our commitment to ensure that future generations hear our voices and stories, please help make this happen with your gift. You can either scan the QR code that you see on the screen or type in giveq.org. Giveq.org on your phone, tablet, or laptop. With your credit card in hand, it takes only a couple of minutes to make a gift, and your gift does make a difference. Finally, I remind you that if you would like to offer personal greetings or comments to Jim or RG, just remain here, and you will be invited into the Zoom room with them. On behalf of everyone here, I offer so much gratitude to you, Jim and RG, for this enlightening conversation that's shared with us. And good night to all. Thank you.